I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source. Call this one a recap of the civics lessons we got and forgot in the 6th grade. The deep secrets of freedom in the United States Constitution. Our teacher this time is the capital I independent U.S. Senator from the cranky Yankee state of Maine, Angus King. You've been in the thick of the Trump II inaugural wars, Angus King, with some distinction in your own style. Your tone on the Senate floor has been measured, your language old-fashioned, and your message a deadly warning. What's at risk, you keep saying, are the famous checks and balances around power itself in the Constitution. This clumsy system of self-rule, you call it.
Chris, pleasure to be with you again. Look, the Constitution divided power between the branches of government on purpose. The framers had just fought a brutal 8-year war against a king, concentrated authority. And they didn't want a king. They didn't want a monarch. They didn't want a dictator. And they realized that if you put all the power into one set of hands, it's just dangerous. The ancient principle is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they were trying to deal with that fundamental issue by putting certain powers in the Congress and certain powers in the presidency. In fact, in Article 2, they severely limited the powers of the president because, again, they were afraid of a king, of a monarch. The president does have the power as commander-in-chief in time of war, but interestingly, they even split that power and gave the power to declare war to Congress. There was quite a debate at the Constitutional Convention in August of 1787 about the war power, and they split it because they didn't want a president running off and starting a war on his or her own. Now, the other piece was who makes laws? And they gave the power to make laws to the Congress. And in Article 2, the president's responsibility, not power, but responsibility, and this is an exact quote, is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It doesn't say make your own laws, decide which laws you like, enforce some and not others. It says take care that the laws, all laws, be faithfully executed. Again, why did they do this? Not because they wanted to create a clumsy system just for fun, or it was just Madison's weird idea. It was to purposefully keep power out of the hands of one person or one institution. That's where we're in trouble right now, because the actions of this administration have clearly crossed that line to take the power of legislation from the Congress to the president. Closing AID. I'm sorry, AID was created by statute. It was a statute of Congress signed by the president, I think I can't remember, 1998. And to say, we don't like AID, we're going to close it down, is a straight up violation of a law passed by Congress and the president taking it unto himself to make those kinds of decisions. The same thing goes with appropriations. One of the first things they did, as you know, is froze appropriations.
Right.
An appropriations bill is a law.
Freezing appropriations is known as impoundment. It's a no-no. And yet, it's not quite as clear, Angus, as you think it is, that the Supreme Court that we have today is going to uphold your view. Probably the Madison view.
I can't speak for the Supreme Court that we have today. I do know that in 1973, Nixon tried to impound funds of programs he didn't like. So the Congress almost unanimously, Republicans and Democrats in 1974, passed something called the Impoundment Prevention Act or something like that. So not only is impoundment unconstitutional, it's also just flat illegal. Now, what is this Supreme Court going to say? I can't predict it. I have a hope, and it's also an instinct, that John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett and maybe even Gorsuch will draw the line here. They call themselves originalists. It would be hard to argue that the intent of the Constitution was to allow the president to rewrite or ignore laws passed by Congress.
Angus, we're going to come back to the legal arguments here, but I'm also interested in the popular response to all this news. You're home on a break for a couple of days in Brunswick, Maine. What difference do you feel you pick up in the talk and the mood, the difference from Washington?
I think people are waking up to the fact that what's going on isn't good. It's a combination of the usurpation of power, but a lot of what Musk is doing, sending an email to all federal employees, tell me the 5 things you did last week, the arbitrary firing of people. And when I say arbitrary, apparently what they're doing is firing everybody that's in probationary status because they can get away with that outside of the civil service laws. But if you think about it, that's random. I mean, the world's best employee of the Department of Agriculture may have been hired last summer, so they're still on probation, but they're getting fired.
Yeah, they start to notice, Shirley, when 6 senior generals are purged in the same weekend, and you wonder.
Listen, that's really scary because not only did they purge the generals, what hasn't gotten as much attention, they purged a bunch of JAG officers, judge advocate generals, and inspector generals. And those are the people who tell the generals when they're getting an illegal order. In other words, one of the protections that we have is the military are not supposed to obey an illegal order. But if you purge the lawyers who are defining an illegal order and you purge the generals and put in people whose loyalty seems to be to the president and not necessarily to the country or to the Constitution, that spells trouble. That's a scary move. And you add all these things together, and that's what puts us into this, what I consider one of the most serious moments in our history.
I'm interested in more vox pop from Brunswick, Maine, and the mood of people. But also, isn't it curious that Maine is suddenly toe-to-toe in this fight with Donald Trump? Your governor, Janet Mills, was face-to-face with the president at the White House with a lot of other governors last week. He brought up his own ban on trans athletes playing women's sports, and he asked your governor, Janet Mills, if she was on board. She replied, "I'm complying with state and federal laws." And the president actually said, "We are the federal law, and you better comply, or you'll lose other funding." And she said, "I'll see you in court." That sounded to me like a constitutional crisis in itself, practically.
It is. It wasn't only other funding. He said, we'll cut off all federal funding. Imagine that for a minute, that the president has the power, or thinks he has the power, to cut off federal funding to a state because the state is doing something as a matter of policy that he doesn't agree with. Is he going to say next, no federal money to Nevada because they voted for Kamala Harris? I mean, where does that end? Again, it's a huge power that this administration is taking on that is nowhere in the Constitution. These funds coming to Maine are duly appropriated by the Congress in appropriations bills signed by the president. Some of them may have been signed by this president, for all I know. And he's taking it upon himself that he can decide what the law is and tell a state that they're going to cut off their funds. To go back to your original question about what are people thinking, a lot of people are really concerned. I'm deluged by people saying, what do we do? How do we stop this? How terrible it is. But it's also, let's not, get ourselves into a bubble here. There are plenty of people who are saying, great, he's doing what he said he was going to do. He's cutting the federal government. He's saving us money. He's ending the deficit. I don't want to overstate the reaction. I think the public mood is turning against this stuff, but there are still plenty of people out there who are all for what's going on. By the way, let me mention one other thing. Hiring federal workers in the larger scheme of the federal budget is not going to save a hell of a lot of money. Let's say they fire 100,000 people. That would save a little more than a 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. 1/10 of 1%. So we're really not talking about ending the deficit or getting us out of debt by firing federal workers. At the same time, what you are doing is diminishing the services that those federal workers provide, whether it's people answering the phone at the VA or the IRS or at the Social Security Administration, people getting checks out. They fired 300 or 400 people at the FAA after 3 or 4 of the worst airline problems we've had in this country in years. What genius had that idea?
Angus King, the more I listen to this argument, I wonder, what if the crisis in the country is not a collision between 3 co-equal branches? It's almost the opposite. It's the collapse of assertive, independent thinking in the Congress and the conservative supermajority in the judiciary. 3 branches that think broadly very much alike and now in Trump time are expected to serve one master.
Usually in history, Chris, in my reading, presidents always want more authority and power. I mean,
And they've got an awful lot of it over the last century, steadily.
most of it was given away by the Congress. The president didn't seize it, the Congress abdicated. For example, Congress hasn't declared war since 1942. All these wars that we've been in have been through some kind of sort of authorization, but not a declaration of war. So Congress has abdicated that responsibility. And you're absolutely right. What's going on now, and what I'm trying to do is wake up my colleagues. They are giving up the most basic powers of the institution, which is bad in itself, but it's also giving that power to one man. And that's not how our system was designed. This isn't technical legal stuff. This is protecting the public from the inevitable abuse of someone with dictatorial powers.
It's a life and death issue, absolutely staring us in the face on the matter of war powers. As you say, not since 1942. God knows we've had awful wars and losses since then, and we've inflicted incredible damage in the world. Who do we hold responsible for that? For what you say is endangering our freedom? Who's the villain in this piece?
What bothers me is that there are a lot of people in the Congress, my Republican colleagues, who are just not confronting this issue. They're deliberately avoiding it. That's pretty frustrating. And I understand there's a lot of pressure. They're being told that if you buck us, if you vote against some of these terrible nominees, we will primary you and Musk will pay for it. And that's a new level of threat. And what a lot of my friends are saying, my Republican friends, is, well, the courts will take care of it. Well, that's a cop-out, number one. Number two, the courts may not take care of it. Number three, we were the ones that took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. And here's something interesting, Chris. In the oath that we take, it's to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic.
They anticipated something.
Exactly. The framers anticipated the problem of an enemy of the Constitution from within. I made a speech on the floor last Thursday where basically I said, when are you guys going to wake up? And this is more important than just a tussle between the president and the Congress. That kind of thing goes on all the time. But if you let this happen, it's going to be very hard to set it right. I think back to Nixon's impeachment, and the key moment in 1974 was when 6 Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee voted for the articles of impeachment. One of them, by the way, was Bill Cohen of Maine. And when they did that, it was the Republican vote that really swung it to the impeachment. And then, of course, a group of Republican senators went to the White House and told Nixon it was over and he had to leave. That's not happening now. The Democrats are trying hard. We're making speeches. We're keeping the Senate in session. We're staying up all night. We're doing all the things we can do. But the real power is with the Republicans. They have the majority in both houses. And they're the ones that have the power to put a stop to this. So far, they haven't shown any inclination to do so.
What do you think the framers, those wise men in the 1780s, what do you think they anticipated about the almost inevitable concentration of power in the executive? Or did they see it that way? And most particularly, what would James Madison be saying today about the executive power?
Madison had a wonderful quote. I think it's in the 51st Federals. He said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, there would be no checks necessary. But the problem lies in this. To create a government of men over men, first you must empower the government to control the governed, and then you must oblige it to control itself. And that's where the checks and balances come in. The ancient question, Chris, from the Romans is quis custodes ipsos custodiet? Who will guard the guardians?
Right.
The paradox is we give the government power to protect us. Army, police, the preamble of the Constitution, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, provide for the common welfare. The challenge, which the framers clearly understood, was how to give the government those powers without creating a situation where the government itself could turn around and abuse us. The purpose of the Constitution is to divide power. And to the extent that we allow power to be concentrated, we're in trouble. Again, Donald Trump could be an angel, could be the most benevolent person in the world. But history and human nature tells us that too much power creates a situation that ultimately will lead to abuse of the citizens.
Angus King, I'm impressed by your intimacy with James Madison and the way you weave him into the conversation in 2025. But it just strikes me that if James Madison could see our world, before he got to the legal arguments, he would say there's so much other language that's more interesting, more revealing in a certain way. The body language, the technology that frames our political conversation today. He didn't recognize the President of the United States in the Constitution as a CEO, but what in the world would he make of a president hiring his own CEO, Elon Musk, a man who brandishes a chainsaw as his kind of tribute to a tool that gets things done? And he also says he spent a weekend after the inauguration feeding a branch of the State Department, USAID, into the wood chipper.
I found that particularly offensive and galling. Here's the richest man in the world bragging, gloating about literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry kids in Sudan.
And yet he says it in the wide open with a certain energy and aplomb, and he thinks he's scoring.
Some of my colleagues go to the floor and they list some of these programs that AID is funding, and they're questionable. Okay, so if you don't like some of the programs, eliminate them. You're in charge of the agency, but don't eliminate the whole agency and fire these people. Listen, I've met with AID people. I'll never forget sitting down with a group of AID people in Kabul, Afghanistan. They were really bright, capable people trying to help the Afghan farmers improve their agricultural productivity. And those are the kind of people that we've just cast adrift. There's a big desalination plant underway in the country of Jordan. They're about to run out of water that AID is supporting. Now that's been thrown aside. So closing AID is a geopolitical disaster. It's opened the way for the Chinese and the Russians to step in and basically take over what's going on in the world. It's terrible. And we haven't even started talking about Ukraine. To call Zelensky a dictator and basically say, you think Putin's got it all going? Chris, there's only one dictator in that deal, and that's Vladimir Putin.
Come back to the matter of the chainsaw as a demonstration of who's in charge. He's not embarrassed by that. He hasn't been talked out of it. Trump himself said over this past weekend, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." He was quoting Napoleon. That's his standard.
That was a very ominous statement, that quoting of Napoleon, because the logical conclusion is, okay, well, I'm saving the country, so I don't have to obey any law. And by the way, J.D. Vance has made some noises about not obeying court decisions. So this could go to a whole new level
Right.
if they ignore the court decisions.
Yeah, just a few days ago, J.D. Vance said that judges, the judiciary, aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Doesn't spell it out, but it's one more voice of the executive runs this country. James Madison, to the contrary, notwithstanding. I mean, all of those expressions come out in some fashion of another school of thought, quite unlike yours, the so-called unitary executive theory, beloved of Dick Cheney, also the late Justice Scalia, we're told, and surely the Trump people, that the executive runs everything down to the last detail. Thank you very much. You may leave now, Congress.
That's a wacky theory. It's been kicking around for some time. Listen, people complain, well, it's inefficient. You got to go to Congress and do all this, and it takes years, and you got the filibuster and everything. That's the way it was designed, intentionally, to keep us from having one person have all the power. And this unitary executive theory goes back some time. This guy, Russell Voigt, new head of the OMB, that's what he thinks. And he says the Impoundment Prevention Act is unconstitutional. We're going to find out. Boy, I'll tell you what, there's a lot of weight on the courts coming. And with that statement by Vance about the legitimate power, the word legitimate is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But the Supreme Court is here to draw the lines, to say what is a usurpation of power, what is the rightful congressional power. A lot of the weight is going to come down to John Roberts.
There's something in the background, hard to pin down, but the background of these assertions of executive authority that fits a mood in this country. And I don't want to justify it, but The country is not in the mood for political discourse these days. There may be too much compromise in it. I'm thinking also there's something in our imagery and our feeling about politics and voting that comes to feel pre-internet.
Chris, you got to realize dictatorships, pharaohs, kings, presidents for life, emperor, that's the norm in world history. What we have is unusual.
Exceptional, we like to say.
Exceptional. Well, that's sort of self-congratulatory, but I
Right?
say anomaly. What we have is unusual, and the typical system through thousands of years have been one man rule. We've seen before our eyes democracies like ours slide toward dictatorships.
Yep.
Hungary,
That's
Egypt.
the problem.
That's the problem. And everybody in America thinks, well, it can't happen here. That's what I'm trying. It's funny. I was thinking this morning, I don't want to liken myself to Paul Revere or Chicken Little or whoever, but I feel like I'm trying to wake people up that this is not a drill. This is a 5-alarm emergency.
I hear that, but even by your own description, Senator King, it strikes me that what looms ahead of us is an unequal partnership between a rampant executive and a nearly collapsing Congress. We don't quite read the Supreme Court on all of these issues yet, but the question is, what, if anything, can be done?
I'm not giving up on the Congress. I'm still talking to my colleagues. I'm still goading them. My speech the other day, I kept saying, what's it going to take? I made an earlier speech a week or so ago about Madison and the division of power, saying, what are your red lines? Maybe the Constitution itself ought to be a red line. So I'm not giving up. It would take about a dozen, probably, Republican senators, like those brave 6 people who got a lot of death threats, by the way, back in 1974 on the House Judiciary Committee. It's going to take some of those people to stand up and say, wait a minute, this isn't what the people voted for. This isn't right. The courts are another backstop. And Chris, the people are the ultimate backstop here. They've got to let their representatives know, their senators and congresspeople of both parties, that they don't like what's going on. Congress is responsive to the public. House members have to run every 2 years. A third of the Senate are running every 2 years. And believe me, we listen. We know the mood back home. And if the mood is, wait a minute, we don't like what's going on, let's see if you can slow it down, that will translate itself into action in Congress. So I'm counting on the Congress itself, the courts, but mostly on the people saying this isn't the way we want this country governed.
People report even this week a certain stirring of impatience.
I've seen recent polls that things like pardoning the violent guys on January 6th was very unpopular. Very few of the actions that they're taking are popular. I thought it was interesting last week, there was a story that they were about to take over the Postal Service, and there was a huge outcry, and overnight the White House said, well, we're just thinking about it. So I think there's going to be a reaction, and I do think it's starting to build.
Speak about it in some detail. Bernie Sanders is tearing up Nebraska and Iowa, they say, with big rallies to stop the oligarchy. Elizabeth Warren had something like it in Massachusetts. Chris Murphy, Democratic senator from Connecticut, is beginning to get recognized as a clear voice for a democratic resistance. What else do you see?
All of those things are important, and all of us are trying to sort of sound the alarm. One of the problems, Chris, is, as you know, we live in a world of vastly different information spaces. We have people getting their information from one source or the other, and they only hear one side. And so that's one of the challenges. We don't want censorship by any means. I'll never forget being at a forum just before the 2016 election. There was a reporter there who had followed both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for about a year throughout the country. And he said something that resonated with me. He said, these 2 people are running for president of 2 different countries.
Interesting.
We've got people that are in different information universes, but I think the information is starting to get through that what's going on isn't normal and isn't safe. One of the difficulties is that the Democrats, of which I am not one, but the Democrats speak with many voices. The president speaks with one, and the president has the biggest megaphone.
The framers of the Constitution We're not enthusiastic about political parties in general. And I hear more and more people saying that the parties, both parties, are letting the country down right now. We ought to fire the parties. Obviously, you have an interest here as an outspoken independent.
Well, the framers didn't like parties. George Washington's farewell address spends a fair amount of time about
Yep.
the danger of parties. Here's the problem with parties now, Chris, is the primary system. The primary system was sort of developed in the 50s and 60s, supposedly to democratize the nomination process, to get out of the smoke-filled rooms. The problem is the typical average turnout in a partisan primary across the country is 21%. 21% of the party voters. So you're talking about a much smaller group deciding who the nominees are going to be. And that group tends to be the activists, the hottest. On the Republican side, it's the most MAGA Trump. On the Democratic side, it's the most progressive and to the left. The result of that is you get nominees who are on the edges and aren't inclined to try to solve problems. And here's what I've seen, Chris, in the Congress, and I've seen it just since I've been there the last 10 or 12 years. We've got people who are coming who can lose their primary, not because of their position on abortion or immigration or whatever, but because they're viewed as not sufficiently hostile to the other side. If you're viewed as someone who will listen to the other side, compromise, try to solve a problem, that'll lose you your primary. So we've got people coming who literally are afraid to sit down and try to solve a problem. That is a very dangerous place. One of the solutions is to open up the primary so that at least independents can vote and you get a broader selection. But right now, it's very difficult for a moderate to win a primary in either party.
Senator King, I haven't heard from you yet a path that looks plausible to you as a way to challenge the executive practice under Donald Trump. It would seem that birthright citizenship is about as clear as you can get, that it's in the Constitution, including for children of refugees and immigrants to this country. Is that your idea of a violation of the spirit of the language of the Constitution that could be challenged and must be challenged soon?
It's already been challenged. It's already in the courts. And that will ultimately go to the Supreme Court. And I hope and believe that the clear, unequivocal language of the 14th Amendment will prevail. The opponents are putting a lot of weight on the accompanying phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. But I don't think that's going to be successful, given there was a famous case of Wong Kim Ark in the 1890s that said, yes, birthright citizenship is what it says it is. So there's a case where we have to rely on the court. That's a straight up legal question.
How much time have you got? What if it's too late? What does your schedule look like? And why wouldn't, as you say, the birthright citizenship is already in the courts, but what are we waiting for?
Chris, you're echoing many of the emails that I get say, why don't you fix this? Stop it. I can. I don't have the votes, but I can do all I can to raise the alarm, to put pressure on my colleagues, to talk to them privately. The power here is with the Republicans. They have a 6-vote majority in the Senate. They have a 3 or 4 vote majority in the House. And ultimately, they're the ones that are going to have to wake up and change course. I'm not trying to cop out here and say I don't have any responsibility. I'm doing everything I can think of, and I can tell you the Democrats are meeting 2 or 3 times a week and trying to do everything and anything they can do, for example, by slowing down the action of the Senate. We've had, I think, 3 all-nighters where we forced the Senate into session all night, doing all the things we can procedurally, but ultimately we don't have the votes. So the legislative path is to press our Republican colleagues to see that what's going on here isn't politics as usual. It's not normal. It's not just a little friction between the executive and the legislative, and to start to say this isn't going to happen. Just as it was in 1974 when the Republicans were the ones who ultimately told Nixon he had to leave office. In this case, the Republicans are the ones that have to tell the president he's got to quit abrogating power unto himself, to abolish agencies, to withhold funds, to try to intimidate the military. That's what's got to happen.
It's an unprecedented situation on the street where I walk, and not to mention online. I wonder if you think about unprecedented responses to what I would call something like a rising panic. Have we lost our country? Is the Senate ever going to do anything about it?
I mean, that's a lot of the correspondence I get from friends and from constituents, people I don't know, saying, we're scared. I see people on the street and they look to me for reassurance, and it's difficult for me to provide reassurance because I think it's the most serious situation that we've ever faced in this country in terms of the collapse of our governmental structure. And by collapse, what I mean is the consolidation into a single set of hands. I said on the floor the other day, if this continues, we may as well go home. And some of my conservative friends said, yeah, that'd be good. Just go home.
Your colleague from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, says it's the most serious situation this country has been in since the Civil War. That's pretty extreme talk, but it sounds plausible.
I've said this is the most direct assault on the Constitution in our history. The Civil War was a different kind of issue. It was an attack on the country itself, but this is the most serious attack on the fundamental structure of our government that we've ever experienced.
Angus King, it's always a pleasure to hear an independent man's mind at work. All the better from Maine. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your seriousness around this situation.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think one of the keys to solving this problem is for people to be aware. You're certainly helping that to be the case. And I want to thank you for your voice over many, many years. It's great to be with you. Keep shining a light on this. You do your thing and I'll do mine.
We do our bit, and we'll check in again soon. Senator Angus King, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. Great to be with you.
We rely on listener support here at Open Source. Now's the time. If you haven't done your part yet, go to radioopensource.org/donate, please, and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Open Source is proud to be a member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to politics to art to technology. We come together around the principle that independent voices are more important now than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you.